So for our in-class exercise, we began talking about how to block in shapes of value and how to use the layers panel as a tool to assist us in that process so that we can stay organized along the way. And so the first thing that we're going to do with this exercise is we're going to create our value scale. And one of the easier ways to do that is we're going to use our rectangle tool. The keyboard shortcut will be the letter M. And all you have to do is click once, and this dialog box will pop up, and we are going to create a 1" by 1" square, like so. Once you have this created, I'm going to copy and paste it 7 times. So I should have 7 squares. And it looks like, oh, I've got an extra. So the next thing I'm going to do is I want these to all line up. And to do that, I can go over to my Align tool over here. If it doesn't show up, you can find it under Window. And in the Align panel, I am going to put these all on the same level. Any of these will do this because they are all the same size. And then what I'm going to do is distribute spacing. And to do that, I'm going to click on this Align to Key Object option, which has a tiny little key to let you know it's a key object. And you'll see that now I have 1 square selected, and it's saying it's going to align all of these equidistant space from this key object. And because we don't want any space between them, we're going to keep this at 0. And we want these distributed horizontally. So we're going to click on this option right here, Horizontal Distribute. And that will put them all in one consistent line, at which point I can click on them and center them under my image. Now, it's not crucial that you do this, but it can save you a little bit of time when you're using this software if you know that you have that rather than relying on those Snap to guides. The next thing we have to do is figure out what our value scale is going to be. So if you go over to Window, I'm going to open up our swatch panel. And we are going to start by using this default grayscale, but we are going to have to depart from it a little bit. And if you do not see this, if you open your swatches and there's no information here, all you have to do is go over to your swatch library menu, and then it gives you a bunch of options. For our purposes, we are just going to use our default art and illustration swatches. So we know when we do this, the first square that we have, the fill is going to have to be white, and the last square, it's going to have to be black. So I'm going to click on this black, and then this square, I'm going to leave white. And I have to figure out what I want to happen for these squares in between. So as a point of departure, I can begin by clicking on some of these values and working my way to lighter and lighter values to get to those high key ones. And that gives me a pretty general value range, but we want this to be as gradual a transition as possible so we're not jumping drastically from one value to another. And so you'll have to spend a little bit of time finessing these to get this to be a little bit more succinct, because this to this is pretty mild, but this starts to feel like a bit of a leap, and this to this feels like a little bit of a leap as well. And so what you can do is when you select the square, you can then go back over to your swatch panel, and if you double click on the highlighted swatch, we are only going to worry about K. K is going to be our black to white. We don't need to worry about CMY. Those are going to give it a hue or a tint, and we do not want that. And so I'm going to bump this up just a little bit. And you'll notice now that I've bumped that up, I might find that this one needs to be adjusted as well. So I'm going to spend a few minutes just tweaking these, getting them where I want. And it's going to be a little bit of a push and pull, but keep in mind that if you don't do this accurately, it's going to impact the overall quality of your image. All right, so now that I have a value panel that looks a little bit more evenly balanced and consistent in transitioning from one square to another, what I am going to do is I want to basically import this over into my swatch panel so I don't have to keep referencing it. And the easiest way to do that is to actually just highlight all of these. And once I have them highlighted, in my swatch panel, I'm just going to click on this folder, new color group, and I am going to give it a name. 7 values is probably the easiest. And you'll notice it automatically will populate, so now I have these to choose from throughout this whole process. So once we've done that, the next thing we want to do is to start blocking this in as shapes of value. And throughout this process, what we're going to focus on is working from the back to the front and from very general areas to gradually making more specific decisions. And the reason we wanted to do that is if we think about the layers panel as actual, layers or like a piece of paper that we were stacking on top of one another, we would want our larger pieces of paper in the back and our smaller pieces of paper on top where we're applying detail, almost like if this were a collage. So I'm going to rename my bottom layer reference image. You can call it whatever is going to help you remember it. I'm going to make this reference image, and then I'm going to go to the bottom and I'm going to hit this create new layer option. And this layer, I'm going to double click to give it a new name, and I'm going to call it background. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm temporarily going to lock this background layer just so it doesn't keep flashing on me. And I am going to establish my background and that table, because those are the things that are going to be kind of the farthest away from us. And this table and lemon, or excuse me, this plate and lemon will be resting on top of it. So again, an easy way to do that, I can use my rectangle tool, and I'm going to make sure that my stroke is turned off. And I'm going to pick a value that I think will work. Again, I can always change these, and I'm going to line it up to the edge of that table. And I'm going to do the same thing with the bottom half, in this case picking a slightly lighter in value rectangle. And again, I can always change these. I'm just trying to give myself a general foundation. And now that I've done this, I'm actually going to go over to my layers panel, and I'm going to hit the plus symbol, and I'm going to make a new layer that I will call plate. And I'm going to make a new layer that I will call plate. So if I double click, I can type in my title, hit enter. And as I'm doing this, you just want to be sure that you're working in the correct layer. And you'll know this because as you start to make marks, the highlighted color will match the layer that you want to be in. So if I go to make a mark and it's red, it's going to tell me that that's telling me that I am actually in the background layer, which I'm temporarily going to turn off. And now I need to map out this plate. Now there are a few ways you could do this. You could go in and use the pen tool. You could also just use this ellipse option and click and drag to make an ellipse that's close to the plate, but not exact. And now I'm going to actually go over to my properties panel and I'm dropping the opacity down just a little bit so I can see the plate through it. And I'm going to go over to my direct selection tool and click on an anchor point to activate them. And now from here, I can stretch this and finesse it to get it to line up where I want it to. And once I have it lined up, I'm going to bring the opacity back up. And I am going to then go into my layers panel, turn or open up that folder that says plate, and I'm going to turn off that first image. And now I'm going to start blocking in some of these highlights. And to do that, I'm going to use the pen tool. And I would encourage for this part that you turn off the fill, otherwise it's going to try and fill this in as you go. And I'm going to start just picking out general highlights. Again, we're trying to keep this really general to start, and we will become more specific as we go. And don't worry if this extends beyond the edge of the image. That is absolutely fine, because we can always crop it down. So that gives you a little bit of wiggle room to kind of maneuver and not have to worry about getting everything perfectly accurate. And now I'm going to set the fill. I know this is lighter than the plate, so I'm going to pick a slightly lighter value, and I'm going to do the same thing back here. And I'm going to draw as though that lemon isn't even there, because ultimately, when I go to draw the lemon, it's going to go right over the top of this. And this is why I always encourage you to keep your fill turned off, because as you can see, it's starting to try and fill in the bottom of that plate. All right. And now that I have that, I can go in and I can turn that foundational plate on and see how this is starting to look. I can go in and I can adjust and make any changes that I need to get it to look a little bit more accurate. And then I can always go and turn them off again and start to block in some of those darker values. I think that this plate could have been a little bit darker, so I'm actually going to take this and bring that up a value and then see how that looks, which feels a little bit more accurate. And then I can start to turn these off and do the same thing. And again, we're going to ignore the fact that that lemon is here, because anytime I go to draw that lemon, I'm just going to draw it right over the top. Which gives me a little bit of wiggle room. And so it's going to be a push and pull between turning layers off and on to see how things are starting to look. And that's feeling pretty structural. I think I'll continue to make changes, but now I'm going to start focusing on that lemon because that's pretty focal to the image. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to just temporarily fold up that layer and turn the plate and background off. And I'm going to go to the bottom, hit that plus symbol to create a new layer, and we're going to call it lemon. And just as before, we're going to use that pen tool. And I'm going to start by outlining that lemon. I'm going to pick a pretty light value, pretty high key value. And pop a value back in there. And the same thing, just come over here, temporarily turn that off. And then go in and start to look for those darker areas. And thinking about these as basic shapes. Again, we want to work kind of general to specific. And then we'll see how we're doing. And all right, that's starting to take some structure. It's starting to look a little bit better, but I definitely need to think about adding in some of those midtones. And so I'm going to go in and kind of pick out a few slightly darker values. And again, I'm really trying to think of these as shapes. And as you can see, as I start to turn these layers back on, it's starting to feel more structural and starting to feel more representational to what we were initially looking at. Now there are some issues. This layer right here, you'll notice, or this shape right here, it's actually on top of these, and I don't think that we want it to do that. And so what we can do is in our layers panel, remember how I said that we want to think about these as actual, like almost like they're sheets of paper? This is the most recent thing that I did. And if I don't want it to be on top, I can literally click it and drag it and pull it down, and you'll see that it starts to put it behind that shape. And there may be things I need to do, like move some anchor points. What we don't want are teeny little gaps like that, that kind of essentially reduce the illusion of dimension in an image. And so those are going to be some of the smaller tweaks that we're going to have to make to help create a sense of dimension. The other thing we can start to do as this becomes more and more complex is we can begin to work in smaller details using the pencil tool. And so if I turn these off again, I can kind of get a sense of areas where I might want a really high key value. And so I can use my pencil tool, which is going to be the keyboard shortcut N. And I'm going to pick one of my brightest values and make sure that you have the layer turned on. And the nice thing about the pencil tool is it starts to smooth out curves as you. So if we look at this now, it's coming along pretty well. Of course, there are changes that I would like to make, pushing in a highlight at the bottom, starting to separate between this value and this value. And those are decisions that you're going to have to make as you progress with this process. And some of it's going to be really based on what your own intuition tells you is going to look good. Because again, we're going from a color image to a grayscale image. And so some of those areas of contrast might read really well in color, but they're going to be a little bit harder to suss out when we're only working in grayscale. But as long as you can, be mindful that your layers panel is organized and that you're really considering working from general to specific and back to front, you'll have a better shot of being successful with this assignment. And this is going to be the precursor to when you go in and start to do this for your self-portrait.